Story 1. Creepy Motel. While on a road trip through Ohio, I started feeling drowsy behind the wheel and decided to stop in a small town called Xenia. I searched for a place to rest and discovered a motel named the Xenia Country Inn. It appeared a bit shabby, though to be honest, the entire town looked that way. Since I only needed a simple night's sleep, I parked my car and walked to the modest front office located at the corner of one of the two motel buildings. Inside, an elderly man was reading a newspaper. The room was stifling and filled with the loud hum of a tabletop fan. I requested a room, and the man eventually lifted his gaze from his paper without greeting me, stating, "$65." Assuming he meant $65 for the room, I handed over my credit card. When I inquired about a corner room, he curtly replied no. Clearly, good customer service was not part of the deal. He then handed me an old-fashioned key attached to a plain key ring since they still didn't use key cards at this place. I made my way across the parking lot to my room, where I struggled to unlock the door and had to wiggle the key a bit until it finally turned. Before entering, I scanned the parking lot and noticed only two other cars, making the area feel deserted. Stepping inside, I was met with a smell that mixed cotton and vomit. I considered asking for a different room but quickly realized that, by the look of this place, every room likely reeked the same. The small room featured a faded blue carpet, a couch, a tiny coffee table, and a bed. I closed the door and attempted to lock it, but encountered some difficulties. It was even trickier than unlocking it. After roughly 30 seconds of wiggling, nearly straining a blood vessel, I suspected I might have damaged it. However, when I tried to open the door again, it wouldn't budge, so I figured that as long as it stayed shut, it didn't matter if it wasn't properly locked. I climbed into bed and listened to the creaking springs as my weight sank into the mattress and frame. I attempted to turn on the TV, but unsurprisingly, the remote failed, so I simply nestled under the covers and tried to sleep. Then a loud thump at the window nearly made me jump out of my skin. I glanced at the figure standing outside, who began speaking in a pained tone, pleading, "Hey, please let me in, I'm badly hurt and need help," clearly having seen me in bed. I shouted for him to go to the front desk, but he wouldn't stop. I knew there was no way I would open the door, feeling he was pretending and setting a trap. Eventually, after ignoring him for a while, he finally departed. I looked again to confirm his absence, and indeed, he was gone. It dawned on me just how genuinely dangerous this area was. I had to rise and inspect the door's lock to ensure it wouldn't open. I tugged firmly at the door, confirming it was secure, then drew the curtains over the two windows so he couldn't peek back in. Although the encounter rattled me, my nerves subsided within half an hour, and I eventually drifted into a light sleep. I then began dreaming about being trapped in a dark supermarket, chased by a manager, until clicking sounds overwhelmed the dream and shifted it entirely. Then I awoke. For some reason, the room felt cold, and when I glanced down, I saw that the blanket had been removed. I sat up to pull it back over me, but then I noticed a tall figure looming at the foot of the bed. Before I could even scream, he hushed me and instructed me to stay still. He assured me he wouldn't hurt me as long as I remained silent and motionless. Then he inquired about the location of my wallet. I replied that it was in the pocket of my jeans lying on the floor. I could only watch as the imposing figure loomed over me and moved from the bed's foot toward my jeans on the floor. I heard him rummaging through the jeans pocket until he located it. After that, he asked what else was inside. When I explained I was merely on a road trip, he said nothing more and left. I dashed to relock the door as soon as he was gone, struggling with it just as before. I then called the police, but they weren't able to help immediately. We approached the front desk man, who reviewed the security footage. However, the intruder was masked and wore a hat that concealed his features. I eventually received a refund and left. Thankfully, I hadn't carried much cash, so I canceled my cards and ended up sleeping in my car. I learned my lesson, would never stop at a dubious motel again. Story 2. Lake Shadows. Early last year, my father and I drove down to a small town devastated by recent floods for charity work. We had collected a truckload of donated clothes and items to help local families get back on their feet. On our first night, we stayed in a hotel boasting a perfect view of the ocean. That night, my dad and I stayed awake watching the Blair Witch Project on my laptop using the hotel's free Wi-Fi. Needless to say, I got very little sleep. The following night, my mom reserved a motel room for us since we weren't expecting to stay a second night. It was just 100 meters from a trailer park and overlooked a large lake. The area was tucked away from the public and surrounded by trees. My mom explained that every other place was fully booked, so we had no alternatives. We met the two managers who both ran and lived at the motel. One was a kind old lady who explained everything we needed to know, including that the lake hadn't been full for 20 years. In contrast, her husband looked as if he had stepped right out of a serial killer movie. He never spoke a word, never smiled, his wrinkles blended into his face, and dark rings encircled his eyes. That's when my dad and I began to feel uneasy about the place. The day passed in a blur, so my dad and I decided to go out for pizza and a movie later to avoid spending too much time there. When we returned to the motel around 8 p.m., it was pitch dark. While retrieving our luggage from the back of the truck, we discovered a bag of children's clothes hidden beneath a spare tire. We started moving the bag toward the trailer park, thinking a family could put it to good use, when I suddenly felt compelled to return to the motel, especially after watching a scary movie about teenagers encountering a witch in the woods the night before. We took the bag to the front desk and asked the eerie old manager if he could hold on to it for donation to the trailer park, since they were neighbors and we had to leave early the next morning. His eyes widened and he shook his head, declaring, "No way in hell, I refuse to go there," before walking off. My dad and I exchanged glances, silently asking, what the hell just happened? We eventually decided to donate the bag by dropping it off at a charity bin back home. After taking our showers, about an hour later, we finally went to sleep. I clearly recall waking at 2:17 a.m. because of my dad's loud snoring. I stayed up reading on my phone, my body turned toward the door. I also remember hearing cars speeding up and down the driveway that night. At first, I dismissed it as just some folks fooling around. That belief quickly faded when I noticed a vivid blue light seeping through the cracks at the top and bottom of the door, accompanied by soft, unintelligible whispers. I was so frightened I couldn't even move. I was completely frozen in place. My heart pounded in my throat and my hands were literally trembling. Then I heard the door handle begin to rattle, and I knew things were about to go badly. The light then vanished, leaving behind a complete and utter silence. I remained frozen for another 3 minutes, which felt like hours, before I finally woke up and told my dad everything that had happened. He laughed and explained that earlier he couldn't sleep either because he heard scratching sounds on the wall right beside our bed. I was puzzled and didn't believe him until he pressed his finger to his lips and whispered, "Shoo, do you hear that?" Everything fell silent again until I heard brief scratches coming from our bed frame. I jumped out of bed and told my dad we needed to leave immediately. We sneaked to the truck, leaving the room key on the bed. We eventually departed at 2:32 a.m., and I vowed never to set foot near that motel again. Story 3. Under the bed. To sum it up, my ex-girlfriend and I had a very volatile relationship and rarely saw eye to eye. We went on a weekend mountain trip to sightsee and hike, believing it would benefit us. However, things went sour in our hotel room on the second night, and I found I couldn't bear to sleep in the same room with her. Rather than spending around $150 on another hotel room, I drove a short distance to a motel and booked a room at a much lower rate. I figured that by leaving for the night and giving her time to cool off, things might improve by morning. I secured a room for, honestly, $50 for the night. As I headed toward my room, I noticed that the door to the adjacent room was left wide open. Passing by, I peered inside and saw it illuminated by the blue glow of a TV screen, though I couldn't make out what was on it from that angle. There was no one inside, but I didn't linger for fear of appearing strange. I continued on to my own room. The room was modest and standard for the price, featuring a queen-size bed with a tacky floral cover, a TV, and a sofa. Not feeling too sleepy, I lay down with the TV on and played games on my phone for a while. I heard an odd noise that I assumed was coming from the TV, so I turned it off, but the sound persisted, proving it wasn't the TV. I then got up to listen more closely and discovered the noise was coming from the neighboring room. I couldn't tell if it was a couple fighting, the TV in the next room, or even someone in distress. The sound was extremely muffled. At that point, with no other option, I tried to go back to sleep until I heard banging on the wall that divided the two rooms. I got up and moved closer to the wall, and once again, without a doubt, someone was pounding on it with their fist. I wondered why they were doing this. I won't lie, I was a bit spooked, but I felt I had to be brave and confront them. I then approached the neighboring room. Surprisingly, its door was still open and the TV remained on, yet there was no sound. I knocked on the open door, asking if everything was all right or if someone needed help, but received no reply. I even noticed that the bathroom door was ajar with the light off, so I stepped inside slowly and cautiously. Once I moved past the partition blocking the view of the sofa and bed, and still found no one, I just stood there utterly confused. I moved closer to the TV to see exactly what was displayed on the screen. It showed nothing but a blank blue screen. However, a sticky note was attached to the screen, bearing some writing. I removed the note, and it read, "Check under the bed." I let the note fall and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Then I returned to my room and secured it with a double chain lock. I climbed back into bed and texted my girlfriend, explaining what had just occurred and that I was terrified. She called right away, and while I was recounting the incident over the phone, more bangs echoed from the motel room wall. She heard them clearly on speaker and urged me to run to either my car or the front desk. I decided to dash to the front desk in order to request a refund. I told the front desk clerk to check the room next to mine and remove whoever was there, but he simply looked at me and left, insisting that neither room was occupied. He immediately recognized that both rooms were empty, but I insisted he investigate and refund my money. So he accompanied me with a room key in hand and unlocked the door, but this time, the TV was off and the room lay in darkness. He entered the room and checked beneath the bed as the note had instructed. Even the sticky note I had dropped was gone. He refused to give me a refund, but since it was only $50, I wasn't too bothered. I left and returned to the hotel where my girlfriend was, grateful to hug her and sleep beside her. I have no idea what I saw in that motel room, who or what was under that bed, and I really don't want to know.